So what I'm going to do is talk about the, I suppose it's the framework for this project. In the project itself will be other members of the MIGPROSP team talking maybe more specifically about parts of work. I want to talk more about the framework and some of the ideas that inform this research on what we call the drivers of migration governance, not the drivers of migration itself, but how governance systems respond in 4 key world regions: Asia Pacific, Europe, South America, North America, very diverse regions, very different forms of governance, very different patterns of migration, so highly diverse, but with this focus on the drivers of migration governance. So just to inform you a little bit more about what the wider context here. The project itself is a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council, which is a phenomenally supportive and generous funding agency, which is making an enormous difference to research in Europe. The project itself is analysing the drivers of migration governance in 4 very different world regions: Asia Pacific, Europe, North America, and South America. What I'm going to talk today is more of a kind of a framework which draws from phase 1 of the project, 2014 to 2016, in which we conducted 307 interviews in those 4 regions, roughly equally divided between those regions, in, I think, 27 different countries, selected because of their different kind of relationships to regional systems of governance, different kind of migration profiles. And as the third bullet point there points out, we're looking at the missing middle, what we call the missing middle, which is to look at the characteristics of governance systems as structures, processes, and sets of ideas. So we're not so much focused on the reasons why people move. Those are important questions, but we're not so much addressing those questions, the drivers of migration itself. And we're not so much focused on the outputs or outcomes of those systems, the laws and policies. What we're trying to do is understand more about how the people, the actors involved in these governance systems, make sense of their roles, how they understand what it is that they are trying to do. So that could be officials, political leaders, at national, regional, international level, brings in international organizations. It could be business groups, trade unions, civil society organizations, think tanks, universities, actors who have an involvement in what we call migration governance systems, which we understand quite broadly. And we're interested in the characteristics of these processes and a focus which is quite organizational, to understand basic questions in organizational studies. How do these actors make sense of the world out there? And on the basis of these understandings, how do they act? And how do these understandings inform their action? So that's what the project is doing, and I think over the next 2 days we can engage a little bit more with some of the ideas in the project. It might be, obviously, in compressed time now, I'm maybe introducing quite big themes. So what I propose to do is address, 2 questions which I think are at the heart of the MIGPROSP project. I hate saying that acronym. It was invented the day of the submission of the application. You have to have an acronym, and I've now got 5 years to regret this acronym. But the MIGPROSP, I think I'll just have to stop saying it. The project, the questions that we're going to ask in this project. So these 2 questions are, I suppose they're classic questions in organizational studies, not necessarily in the study of migration, but I think they have quite a lot of very interesting questions, I think, to ask about migration governance. How do actors, and a variety of actors, understanding governance broadly, how do they organize their experiences of migration? How do they understand the causes and effects of migration? How do they understand the risks and uncertainties associated with migration? So we spent quite a lot of time in our interviews trying to understand more about how people understand migration itself. What people understand as the key drivers. Do people think these drivers are going to change in the future? So it's quite interpretive. We're trying to understand more about people's understandings, and then to understand more about how the organization of these experiences shapes action. And as the project develops, we're kind of halfway through the project, so this isn't finished work. I'm introducing to you the kind of a first phase of the research and some things that are developing as the project develops. And this paper is essentially the first chapter of a book I'm currently writing on the drivers of migration governance. So put more intuitively, the question I'm asking in this paper is, well, how do these people understand what's going on out there in this complex, complicated world, which migration is a part, and in which also their organization itself and the role of their organization and its development is also a part. So what's going out there and what should we do next? I won't go too much into governance, but given that governance is all over the program for this conference, I think I should say what I mean by governance. And I understand governance as having a dual meaning. It's to do with the conceptual representation of social systems, the underlying social systems that necessarily underpin the second part of this dual meaning, which is the capacity of organizations to steer or manage change in these underlying systems. So I'm interested in, or understand governance having this dual meaning, the conceptual representation of social systems, what's going on out there, and the empirical analysis of the capacity to steer or manage the effects of change in these underlying systems. And again, put more intuitively in relation to migration, we know that international migration is epiphenomenal. It happens because other things change. To understand migration, we have to understand these other changes, which are economic, social, political, demographic, and environmental, which can all have an impact on migration itself. Now, the project that I'm talking about today, we're not trying to map or quantify these potential drivers of migration. What we're trying to do is learn more about how actors in migration governance systems understand these key underlying systems. How do they understand the effects of economic, social, political, demographic, and environmental changes? How does it affect governing organizations and their role, and how those roles, their kind of capacity to adapt? So what I'm now going to do is really just, in the time I've got left, go through 7 theses on migration governance, which really are essentially the framework for the book. And the first thesis is that migration governance itself is a signifier of change in underlying social systems. And I just explain what I mean by that. I would see these underlying economic systems as economic, social, political, demographic, and environmental. Change in and interaction between those social systems can have powerful effects on migration, affect people's decisions whether or not to migrate, who migrates, the distance they move, the duration of that migration. As I said, our intention isn't to quantify the effects of these drivers, but to learn more about how actors in governance systems understand these effects, because these understandings, as has been demonstrated in significant research in political science and organizational studies, these understandings can have powerful effects whether or not they are accurate. So understandings don't have to be accurate. Maybe they are plausible stories about the world, but they have powerful effects. So the framework for the analysis is interpretive, to understand how actors in migration governance systems understand the effects of change in underlying social systems. And that's really at the heart of what we're doing. The second thesis, and following from the first, is that migration governance is grounded in processes of issue framing. And a frame, as I suppose as many as people will know, can be understood as a means of organizing experience, a kind of cognitive frame, a way of understanding the world to then try and guide action. And in the paper itself, which is on the conference drive, I think the papers are gathered, I think you've got a link to it. In the paper itself, I won't have time now to go into it, but there's a discussion in the paper of how in major destination countries in Europe and North America, there is an idea of what is called the new normal. And the new normal is a phrase that's used because people referred to it in interviews when speaking to us. This idea that the major destination countries face significant pressure on external borders now, and that will continue in the future, and that it is something has changed. Now, the interesting thing for our project is that somebody mentioned this idea of a new normal in an interview to us based on a meeting that had occurred between the European Commission and US government agencies. And then the precise same phrase, a new normal, appeared in the Commission communication in June 2016 on a new approach to working with third countries, a new framework approach for the European Union to work with third countries. And it was also used to us in interviews in the United States. So in the paper, there's a little story about this idea of a new normal. And it's not whether it's accurate or not, but our idea is these understandings have effects. Significant migratory pressures. And I think that informs, there's ideas about what's pulling this migration and whether or not we agree that pull factors are the key thing in migration, but the idea of pull factors, the idea about welfare state pull factors, which may well be questioned by the research evidence, but we find evidence of understandings which talk about pull factors, understand significant external pressures, and I think governance systems are grounded in these processes of issue framing, understandings that then guide action. The third thesis is, well, and in a way this is just drawing from classic themes in organizational studies. Migration governance must be centered on relations between organizations and their environment. Organizations will be trying to respond to signals or cues from their environment to make sense of what is going on out there. Now, in migration research, I think there's a tendency to focus on so-called failure, that policy and institutions systematically fail. And I think either implicitly or explicitly in the literature on migration, quite a strong focus on failure, policy failure. You know, a very famous article by Stephen Castles is called Why Migration Policies Fail. There's no doubt about it, why migration policies fail. Now, they may fail to achieve their objectives, but most policies fail to achieve all their objectives. And what the organizational studies literature tells us is that, well, it's kind of banal, but the world is complex. The migration field is complex. Organizations can at times be pursuing competing or even contradictory paths and managing competing interests, and at times trying to deal with contradictions is what many modern organizations have to do. So it may be that policies fail, but at least what I think it's important to try to do is understand how organizations in migration governance systems understand their role, understand these signals and cues from their environment. And moving on to the fourth thesis, and getting more quickly as I do the fourth thesis, is that migration governance systems themselves can be both an effect and a cause of turbulence in governance systems. We tend to see migration as an external driver of change in governance systems. And I think that's a mistake. I think governance systems themselves play powerful roles in constructing the world out there and can be causes of turbulence. And just to provide a very quick example, this is a map from Europol, and it's a map of, well, I'm not sure what it's a map of, to be honest. It's a map of Europe, and it's got lots of arrows on it. And what that map is showing us is that people are moving from Africa to Europe, and that is true, we know that. And we know there's a humanitarian tragedy in the Mediterranean. We know, we're very familiar with these stories. But that map is a representation of a certain understanding of migration. Because migration from Africa or within Africa doesn't look like that. There are arrows which move cross borders, there are arrows that might be going to the south. This map is a representation of a particular understanding of migration. And it's representing something that is real. I'm not saying this is just imagined, but it is a representation of migration. And I think these understandings themselves are a cause of turbulence. In a way, this map could be seen as showing migration as a threat or a challenge to European governance. But I also think that the way that these challenges are understood can be seen also as a cause or as a driver of turbulence, because that map it's only representing a small part of a more complex dynamic in Africa. But I think it has powerful effects, and it's based on certain kinds of understandings, certain kinds of interpretations of the world out there. The fifth of these seven is that migration governance is inherently ambiguous. And again, this is a classic theme in organizational studies, because problems and choices can often become decoupled in the jargon, because interpretations are generated in organizations in the face of considerable ambiguity about what is going on out there. And so to provide one example which we're very familiar with in migration is that it can lead to a very powerful role for political and symbolic factors. And just three words: build a wall. Political and symbolic factors. And I think that could be, the kind of rhetoric around walls and fences and borders and boundaries that can obviously translate into real boundaries as well. But I think there's significant scope in migration governance for the decoupling of problems and choices because of the ambiguity of the field, the inherent ambiguity in this field. A sixth thing, and many papers will focus on this today, is that migration governance, some of the words used, it's pluricentric, it's multi-level, it's multi-actor, but the point is this leads to more, not fewer organisations. Migration governance becomes more complex. There are more actors, there are more levels, there are more centres. These could be formal, they could be informal, they could be public, they could be private. We're going to have papers which look across regions at pluricentric, multi-level, multi-actor migration governance. Now, this was a mistake. You can see why, but this was not a good idea. But this quote is, I think, a classic example. It's in the paper. And if I just try to explain it, this was a European official explaining to us his role within the European Commission in relation to migration from the Horn of Africa and thinking about Egypt. And what this quote does is talking about the context for a European Union official operating bilaterally, multilaterally, regionally, in formal and informal settings, talking about what the Egyptians, liaising with the Egyptians, then talking about using the EU Horn of Africa initiative, which is what it initially called, and then we turned it into the Khartoum process as a regional consultation process in the Horn of Africa. All the people will be there. It's sponsored by you, African Union, and we want you to remain an important role in this. And we had signals everybody would come, including Eritrea, which obviously was problematic. That's how it happened. So it tells a story about this Khartoum process. It talks about official interaction, government interaction. This is a quote which, again, is a bit too long. Everybody can read. I don't need to read things to you. And in the paper itself, you get a sense of the complexity of pluricentric, multi-actor, multi-level governance, private, public, official, formal, informal, all in a description of one process. As venues shift as well, new venues are invented. And the seventh and final one is that migration governance is inactive of what in the paper calls sensible environments. And sensible environments are those that are plausible to the people making decisions, and they are shaped by the practical activities of people who are engaged in a way, constructing migration governance through their actions, through their interactions, through the understandings that are generated in all kinds of different settings, in all kinds of different places, leading to very different patterns and systems of migration governance. But this idea of sensible environments is really focused on how actors make sense of their environments. And in the paper itself, there's more explanation of this one, because this is quite central to the book that I'm writing, this idea of sense-making, which again is a key theme in organisational studies, which barely ever features in analysis in political science, but I think can give us useful insights into migration governance. So the conclusions, of which there are three, I'll draw out three, there are other things as well, but just to focus on three. The first of which, understandings of migration, what are its causes, what are its effects, what are the key risks, what are the uncertainties, they play powerful constitutive roles in migration governance. Migration is not just some external challenge to governance systems themselves generate it. Aristide Zolberg told us this back in 1989 in his article, The Next Waves, looking at kind of post-Cold War migration. Migration is defined by the borders and boundaries of political systems. Those borders and boundaries play powerful roles in defining the challenges, the categories that are developed within these governance systems. And I think we have to take very seriously the organisation of governance. The second conclusion is that through the actions and assessment of the effects of these actions, actors in migration governance systems, and obviously there are very important power relationships in these systems, but these actions and assessments play an important role in shaping what it is that these people think they're dealing with. And just as one example, to define what is normal, or to define the possibilities, limits of their action, or to understand what it is they're doing as reactive or proactive, the challenges that they're facing. So and I'll see the stop, and I will stop. Thank you.